The transmission arrived at 0347 station time, and Ambassador Sarah Voss was already awake. She had been awake for most of the past 6 days, which was not unusual for her, and was not remarkable to anyone who knew her well, though there were fewer of those people now than there used to be. She was sitting at the narrow desk in her quarters aboard the Conclave Station Meridian, a structure that orbited no planet in particular and belonged to no species exclusively, which was the point of it. A cold cup of something that had once been coffee sat 2 centimeters from her right hand. A single lamp burned low. She was reading, not dispatches or briefings, but a novel, something old, something earth-printed, the paper kind that she had carried in her bag for 11 years and never quite finished. She liked having it unfinished. It felt like a reason. When the chimes sounded and the small display on her desk illuminated with the seal of the Galactic Conclave's High Directorate, she did not flinch. She set the book down, face down, open, losing her page with the casual indifference of someone who had stopped believing in clean endings. She read the transmission once. Then she read it again, not because she had misunderstood it, but because she was the kind of person who confirmed things. The message was formal, as all Directorate communications were formal, dense with the layered honorifics of 11 different linguistic traditions compressed into a diplomatic pidgin that no species spoke naturally and all species used officially. It was 47 lines long. The operative content was 3 sentences. The Galactic Conclave High Directorate, acting under the authority of the Consolidation Accords and the unanimous resolution of the Primary Member Assembly, formally demands the cessation of all unauthorized expansion activities by the sovereign territory designated Earth Origin Humanity. Humanity is directed to surrender all contested colonial installations, disarm its defensive perimeter grid, and submit to administrative oversight pending full review. Non-compliance within 30 standard cycles will be interpreted as an act of aggression against the consolidated order. Sarah read those 3 sentences a second time. Then she laughed. It was not a performance. There was no one in the room to perform for. It was the kind of laugh that comes from a place beneath strategy, beneath composure, the kind that surfaces when something you have been waiting for finally, irrevocably arrives. It was a short laugh, controlled, more exhalation than sound, but real. And in the silence after it, she said, quietly, to no one, to the room, to the cold coffee and the unfinished novel and the 11 years of carrying both, finally. She sat with that word for a moment. Let it settle. Then she opened a new channel and requested a meeting with Directorate Liaison the Rev-On. The Rev-On was a Selvari, which meant he was tall, blue-gray in the way that certain deep-water things are blue-gray, and possessed of a patience that was biological rather than philosophical. The Selvari had been mediating interstellar disputes for longer than Earth had been writing things down, and they carried that history in their posture the way old buildings carry the weight of their foundations. He arrived at her quarters 20 minutes after her request, which was itself a statement, because Selvari did not hurry, and the fact that he had come at all rather than summoning her told her that the Directorate was not as certain as its transmission implied. She poured him nothing because Selvari did not drink liquids in the presence of others, a biological privacy she had learned to respect without ever fully understanding, and she sat across from him and waited, which was the only negotiating posture that ever worked with his species. Ambassador Voss, he said, and his voice carried the precise neutral weight of someone delivering news they expect to be catastrophic. You have received the Directorate's communication. I have, she said. Then you understand the severity of the Assembly's position. I understand the Assembly's position very well, she said. What I'm uncertain about is whether the Assembly understands ours. The Rev-On tilted his head in the Selvari way, the slight leftward drift that meant he was processing something that didn't fit his model. Humanity's position is not complicated, he said, carefully. 47 installations beyond the agreed expansion boundary. 11 active construction projects in contested zones. 3 incidents involving your defensive systems firing on conclave survey vessels without provocation. With provocation, she said, gently but without hesitation. The survey vessels entered active exclusion zones during a period when we had filed formal notice of military exercises. The notice was filed. It was acknowledged. The vessels entered anyway. She paused. I'm not saying it was a good outcome. I'm saying it was a predictable one, given the circumstances. The circumstances, the Rev-On said, are that humanity has been expanding at a rate that no member species of the Conclave has deemed acceptable. The circumstances, Sarah said, are that we have been asking the Conclave to ratify our expansion proposals for 9 years. All 47 installations were filed. All 47 were deferred, tabled, or referred to committees that have not convened. We didn't expand into unregulated space because we're aggressive. We expanded because our population is increasing at a rate your models haven't accounted for, because we have resource deficits that your trade frameworks weren't designed to address, and because we have been polite about all of it for 9 years and nothing has happened. The silence that followed was the kind that Selvari used instead of expressions. The Assembly, he said finally, does not believe humanity has the capacity to resist the consequences of non-compliance. And there it was. Sarah had been waiting for someone to say it plainly for years, because it had been said in every other way, obliquely, administratively, through deferred proposals and committee delays and the particular kind of bureaucratic slowness that was indistinguishable from contempt. She had been waiting for the plainness of it, the honesty of it, because you could not respond to a thing that was never said directly. "Tell me what the Assembly believes our capacity to be," she said. The Rev On considered whether this was a wise conversation to have. She watched him consider it. "Humanity fields approximately 1,200 functional warships," he said. "The Conclave's enforcement fleet numbers close to 40,000. Your industrial capacity, while impressive relative to your developmental stage, is not sufficient to sustain a prolonged conflict. Your biology is fragile by galactic standards. Your political structures are historically unstable. And you have no meaningful allies within the Conclave membership." She let all of that sit for a moment. "That's accurate," she said. He had expected a rebuttal. She could see it in the slight forward shift of his posture, the Selvari equivalent of bracing. Her agreement disoriented him. "Then you understand," he said carefully, "why the Assembly believes compliance is the rational choice." "I understand why the Assembly believes compliance is the rational choice," she said. "I also understand why they're wrong about what our choice will be." She stood then, not dramatically, not as a display of anything, just because she had been sitting for a long time and her back hurt, which was the kind of unglamorous physical reality that she had long since stopped hiding in professional settings. She walked to the small viewport at the far side of her quarters. The station's rotation brought a slow drift of stars across the glass, unhurried, indifferent. "When the Assembly looks at humanity," she said, "they see the numbers. 1,200 ships. 4 billion people spread across 47 installations. Fragile biology. Political instability. No allies." She was quiet for a moment. "What the Assembly doesn't have a model for is what we do with all of that." The Rev On said nothing, which was his way of saying continue. "Selvari mediators have been in practice for longer than we've had written language," she said. "The Orini have been spacefaring for 6,000 years. The Dvash Collective has not experienced an internal political collapse in 4 centuries. All of the primary Conclave members reached stability before they reached the stars, or they reached stability shortly after, and they have been stable long enough that stability has become their baseline assumption about how intelligent life operates." She turned from the viewport. "Humanity has never been stable. Not once. In our entire history, there has not been a single century in which we were not facing something that should have ended us. Plague. War. Climate collapse. Resource failure. Political fragmentation. Ideological violence. We have been in some form of civilizational crisis for so long that crisis is not an exceptional state for us. It's the water we swim in." The Selvari's head had drifted slightly leftward again. "The Assembly's enforcement action," she continued, "is designed to present us with consequences severe enough to make compliance the rational choice. And I'm telling you that the calculation is wrong, not because the numbers are wrong, but because the Assembly is modeling humanity as a species that will respond to severe consequences the way a stable species responds to severe consequences." She sat back down. "We don't." "Ambassador," the Revon said, and his voice had changed in a way that she could not precisely name but recognized as the early register of something being reconsidered, "are you saying that humanity will resist an enforcement action it cannot win?" "I'm saying that humanity will resist," she said. "The question of whether we can win is one we'll answer while we're doing it. That's not bravado. That's just how we work." She watched him process that. The Selvari processed things visibly, in the sense that their stillness deepened when they were thinking seriously, as if the act of genuine consideration required them to reduce all other activity to near zero. He was very still now. "You came to this meeting," she said, more quietly, "because the Directorate is not certain. If they were certain, they would have sent a functionary with a compliance timeline, not a senior liaison at 4 in the morning. They're uncertain because someone in the Assembly, maybe more than one someone, has looked at the data on humanity's expansion pace and realized that we didn't expand that fast by accident. We expanded that fast because we are that desperate, and desperate things do not respond to the logic of comfortable things." The Revon said, very carefully, "What is it that you want, Ambassador Voss?" "Ratification," she said. "All 47 installations. A new framework for expansion review that operates on timelines compatible with human population growth rates. And a seat on the Resource Allocation Subcommittee that is not advisory." She picked up her cold coffee without drinking it, an old habit, something to hold. "Those were our requests 9 years ago. They haven't changed. The Assembly will not ratify under what they will characterize as coercion." "I know," she said. "Which is why I'm not coercing anyone. I'm explaining. There's a difference." She set the cup down. "The Assembly can proceed with the enforcement action. 30 cycles. I've noted the timeline. What I need you to understand, and what I need you to report, with the full weight of your professional assessment, is what that enforcement action will actually produce." She spent the next hour telling him. Not shouting, not threatening, not performing any of the emotional displays that the Conclave's diplomatic models associated with destabilized human communication. She spoke the way she had learned to speak over 11 years of being the person in the room that no one expected to still be in the room, steadily, precisely, with a particular kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling but its complete containment. She told him about the 1,200 ships, and what their crews had been selected for, and what the selection criteria looked like when you understood that humanity drew its military volunteers disproportionately from populations that had already survived things. She told him about the industrial capacity, which was not impressive by Conclave standards except in one specific regard, which was the speed at which it could be redirected, because human manufacturing infrastructure had been built by people who remembered very recent history in which it had been redirected before, multiple times, and the institutional knowledge of how to do that was still alive and operational. She told him about the 47 installations and what they were really for, not expansion for its own sake, but nodes of a network that had been quietly constructed over 9 years to be resilient in exactly the way a network needs to be resilient if it expects to be attacked. She did not tell him any of this as a threat. She told him as a description of existing conditions, as a report, as the kind of information that a senior Selvari liaison would need in order to give his assembly an accurate picture of what 30 cycles would actually produce. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that the station's rotation had moved the stars entirely out of her viewport and brought a section of deep black in their place. "You have been preparing for this," the Revon said. "It was not an accusation. It was a realization. We've been filing proposals for 9 years," she said. "Yes. We've also been preparing for the possibility that the proposals would fail." She paused. "Not because we wanted a conflict. Because we are human, and we have learned, at a species level, across thousands of years of very hard experience, that you do not wait to see what happens when things go wrong. You prepare. While you still can. While you're still asking nicely." She watched something shift in the way the Revon held himself. Not fear exactly, because Selvari did not produce fear the way humans produced fear, but a recalibration, a structural adjustment in his model of what he was dealing with. "Ambassador," he said, and the word came out with a weight that it hadn't carried when he'd arrived, "when you laughed, when you read the transmission. What was that?" She thought about how to answer honestly. "Relief," she said. "We have been in the waiting period. The period where the outcome is uncertain, and you can't act, and you can't stop acting, and you just have to keep filing the proposals, and attending the meetings, and hoping that the thing you've been preparing for doesn't become necessary." She looked at her hands for a moment. "The transmission means the waiting is over. Whatever happens now, it's happening. That's easier. Uncertainty is the hard part, not the thing itself." He was quiet for a very long time. "I will report to the Assembly," he said. "I know," she said. "Tell them what I told you. Not as a warning. As information. They deserve accurate information before they make a decision this significant. That's all I'm offering." He left, and she sat alone in her quarters with the cold coffee and the unfinished novel, and she was aware, in the quiet way you become aware of large things when you have stopped running from them, that everything from this point forward would be a different kind of difficult than the difficult she had been living in. The waiting kind of difficult was over. She did not know exactly what came next, only that it was coming, and that she would be awake for it, which was fine. She was almost always awake. The assembly did not meet its own 30-cycle deadline. The enforcement fleet did not deploy. What happened instead was slower and less cinematic and, in the long memory of interstellar history, more significant than any single military engagement could have been. The Rev-On's report to the High Directorate ran to 212 pages, which was unusual for a liaison communication, and the section that was most heavily discussed in the closed assembly session that followed was not the section about the ships or the installations or the industrial redirection capacity. It was the section near the end, the part where he had written, in the precise and careful language of a species that had been mediating disputes for millennia and had therefore developed a sophisticated vocabulary for the specific categories of dangerous. The human ambassador did not threaten the assembly. She described a situation. The distinction is important. A threat can be evaluated in terms of capability and willingness and can be negotiated as a function of both. A description of a situation is not negotiable. It simply is. Ambassador Voss described humanity's preparedness for an enforcement conflict not as a deterrent she was deploying, but as a condition she was reporting, the way one reports weather. This is a posture I have not encountered in 340 years of diplomatic practice, and I want to be precise about why I find it significant. It is not that humanity is more capable than the Assembly's models suggest, though that may also be true. It is that humanity's relationship to difficulty is categorically different from that of every other species currently in the conclave framework. They do not experience civilizational threat as a crisis. They experience it as a condition. This is not a psychological aberration. It is a product of their history. And it means that the enforcement calculus the Assembly has applied is the wrong calculus entirely. The ratification of all 47 installations came 6 months later. It came with a new framework for expansion review, and it came with a seat on the Resource Allocation Subcommittee that was not advisory. It came, as these things always do when they finally come, quietly, buried in administrative language, announced without ceremony. Sarah Voss read the ratification notice at 0400, because she was awake, as she almost always was. She did not laugh this time. She finished her coffee, which was for once still warm, and she picked up the novel from her desk, and she found where she'd left off, and she read for 2 hours, until the station's lights cycled up toward morning and other people began to move through the corridors outside her door. She did not think of it as a victory, exactly. She thought of it as the end of one particular waiting, which meant the beginning of another, because there was always another. Humanity would push further. The conclave would resist further. The proposals would be filed. The committees would defer. And somewhere in the gap between the asking and the answering, humanity would be doing what it had always done in the gaps, building, preparing, adapting, persisting, not because it was noble or because it was right, but because it did not know how to stop, and had never successfully learned, and at some point in the very long process of surviving everything that should have ended it, had stopped being certain that stopping was a thing it wanted to learn. The Rev-On filed one final addendum to his report 3 weeks after the ratification. It was 4 sentences. It was not addressed to the Assembly directly, but was entered into the conclave's standing diplomatic record, where it would be available to any member species' diplomatic corps that chose to access it. He wrote, "It should be noted, for the record and for the consideration of any future conclave engagement with Earth-origin humanity, that Ambassador Voss's response to the High Directorate's surrender demand was laughter. Not defiance. Not anger. Not fear. She laughed because the thing she had been waiting for had finally arrived, and she was ready, and the readiness was a relief. Any framework for engaging with this species must begin from the understanding that this is not what a species looks like when it is afraid of you. This is what a species looks like when it has made its peace with the worst you can do and gone to work anyway. The conclave has not, in its long history, encountered that before. It should proceed accordingly." The record was accessed, over the following decade, by diplomatic offices across 31 member species. There is no record of any single species formally responding to it. But the pace of deferred proposals from human delegations dropped by 63% in the 3 years after the Rev-On's addendum entered the system. No explanation was offered. None was requested. Sarah Voss, when asked about it later, by a young attaché who was new to interstellar work and still believed that the significant moments announced themselves, said only that she thought the conclave had started doing the math differently, and that the math, when you did it correctly, always came out the same way. The attaché asked her what way that was. She picked up her coffee. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The way where we're still here," she said.